A black girl lay in the mud after a beating. A cowboy lifted her gently and said, "You're safe now, sweetheart," as thunder crashed over the frontier town that had left her for dead. The townspeople saw only a worthless thief who'd stolen their bread, spitting curses as they returned to their warm saloons. They expected her to disappear by morning, another forgotten soul claimed by the unforgiving territory. But the weathered cowboy who carried her broken body to his cabin had gentle eyes that recognized something the others missed. Hidden in her torn dress were legal papers that could destroy the cattle baron who controlled their corrupt settlement through fear and stolen land. The cowboy didn't know that saving this trembling girl would make him an enemy of the most dangerous man in 3 territories. Will her secret ignite a war that neither of them can survive? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The hunger had been gnawing at Miriam Carter for 3 days when she finally spotted the loaves of bread cooling on Murphy's saloon windowsill. Her father's worn leather satchel pressed against her ribs as she crouched behind a wooden crate in the alley. The September wind carried the scent of fresh baking through Cedar Falls territory, making her empty stomach clench with desperate need. She had arrived in this frontier town after weeks of walking, following the crude map her father had drawn before his death. The papers in her satchel contained his final words about land that belonged to their family, land that could give her a future. But first, she needed to survive long enough to find it. The saloon's back door stood slightly open. Miriam glanced around the empty alley and made her choice. She slipped inside, moving quickly toward the counter where 3 fresh loaves sat unguarded. Her fingers closed around the warm bread, just as heavy boots thundered across the wooden floor behind her. A massive hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. The saloon keeper's face twisted with rage as he saw what she held. His shout brought 4 other men running from the main room, their eyes hard and unforgiving. They dragged her outside as she clutched the bread to her chest. The town sheriff emerged from his office across the muddy street, took one look at the scene and simply nodded. No questions asked, no trial needed. The first blow knocked her to her knees. The second sent her sprawling into the mud as rain began to fall from the darkening sky. She curled into a ball, protecting her father's satchel with her body, as boots connected with her ribs and back. The bread scattered in the dirt, forgotten. Through the haze of pain, she heard their voices discussing her fate with casual indifference. Some suggested running her out of town. Others preferred leaving her where she lay. All agreed she had brought this punishment on herself. The thunder grew louder as they finally walked away, their entertainment finished. Miriam lay still in the cold mud, rain washing the blood from her split lip. Every breath sent sharp pain through her chest. Her father's satchel remained pressed beneath her, its contents still safe. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook with exhaustion. The rain fell harder, turning the street into a river of brown water that soaked through her torn dress. The town's windows glowed with warm lamplight, while she shivered alone in the darkness. From somewhere nearby came the sound of approaching footsteps. Miriam tensed, expecting more punishment. Instead, a gentle voice spoke words she had not heard in months. The man who knelt beside her had weathered hands and kind eyes that seemed out of place in this harsh settlement. He wore simple clothes and moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. When he spoke, his voice carried no judgment, only concern. He lifted her carefully from the mud, supporting her weight as if she weighed nothing at all. Miriam wanted to resist, to maintain what little dignity remained, but her body had reached its limits. She allowed herself to lean against his solid frame as he guided her away from the hostile town. His cabin sat on a small rise beyond the settlement's edge, surrounded by scrub grass and scattered rocks. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls. The man helped her to a chair near the warmth and began gathering supplies without asking permission or expecting gratitude. He cleaned her wounds with steady hands, his touch professional and respectful. When he offered her hot soup and fresh water, she accepted both gratefully. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, as if kindness required no explanation in his world. As the warmth returned to her limbs, Miriam studied her rescuer more carefully. His movements suggested familiarity with treating injuries. His cabin, though simple, was organized with military precision. Most telling were his eyes, which held the alert awareness of someone accustomed to watching and waiting. When she finally found her voice, she told him about her father's death and the long journey that had brought her to Cedar Falls. She mentioned the land claim that had drawn her west, though she kept the details vague. Something in his expression suggested he understood more than she was saying. He introduced himself as Thomas Reynolds, though he said most people called him Grizzly. He had been living alone on this land for 2 years, keeping to himself and avoiding the town's politics. His questions were few but thoughtful, revealing a sharp intelligence behind his quiet manner. As the night deepened, Miriam felt safe enough to retrieve her father's satchel from where she had hidden it beneath her torn shawl. The leather was water-stained but intact. Inside, the precious papers remained dry and legible. She showed Grizzly the deed and survey maps that represented her father's legacy. His reaction surprised her. Instead of the skepticism she expected, he examined the documents with obvious familiarity. His finger traced the boundary lines with the expertise of someone who understood such markings. The papers showed a claim far larger than she had initially admitted. Her father had not simply homesteaded a small plot. He had legally surveyed and registered nearly 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, complete with water rights and mineral claims. Grizzly looked up from the documents with new respect in his eyes. He understood what she had not yet grasped. If these papers were legitimate, she was not just another desperate settler seeking a new start. She was potentially the largest landowner in the territory. The morning sun found Miriam studying her father's maps with intensity that surprised Grizzly. She traced property lines with her finger, muttering calculations under her breath. When he brought her coffee, she looked up with eyes that held new determination. She had slept fitfully, haunted by memories of her father's final days. Marcus Carter had spent weeks preparing these documents, checking every detail twice. He had taught her to read survey markers and understand territorial law because he knew this day would come. Grizzly watched her examine the papers with professional precision. Most people would see only lines and numbers. She saw something entirely different. "Your father knew surveying," he said quietly. "He worked for the territorial government before he got sick." Miriam spread the largest map on the wooden table. "He taught me everything. How to read boundary markers, how to identify forged documents, how to calculate acreage using the government grid system." Her finger stopped on a specific section. The surveyor's marks showed clear measurements and official stamps. Every line had been drawn according to federal standards. Every calculation checked and verified. "This isn't a homestead claim," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "This is a full territorial survey, legally filed and registered in Cheyenne." Grizzly leaned closer to examine the documents. His expression changed as he recognized the technical precision of the work. These were not the rough sketches of a hopeful settler. They were professional government surveys. "How much land are we talking about?" Miriam's answer hit him like a physical blow. 9,800 acres, including the 3 main water sources that feed this entire valley. The implications crashed over both of them simultaneously. This was not about recovering a small farm. This was about controlling the economic future of the entire region. Grizzly sat back in his chair, processing what he had just learned. Every ranch and settlement within 50 miles depended on water from those sources. Whoever controlled them controlled everything else. "The man who has it now," Miriam said carefully. "Ethan Caldwell." "Do you know him?" Grizzly's jaw tightened. Everyone knew Caldwell. The cattle baron had arrived 3 years ago with money and ambition. He had acquired land through methods that raised questions but never official complaints. His influence reached into every aspect of territorial politics. He's powerful, connected, dangerous when crossed. Miriam nodded grimly. She had expected as much. Men did not build empires by respecting the legal claims of dead surveyors and their daughters. "My father mentioned him in his final letter. Said Caldwell had been asking questions about our family's holdings, making offers that weren't really offers." She pulled out a smaller piece of paper, worn from repeated handling. Her father's final message contained warnings about men who would kill to protect their stolen wealth. He had hidden the most important documents and taught her to find them when the time came. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Grizzly moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, moving with the casual confidence of men accustomed to intimidating others. "Caldwell's men," he said quietly. Miriam quickly gathered the papers and returned them to her father's satchel. Her movements were swift and practiced, suggesting she had done this many times before. She tucked the satchel beneath her shawl and positioned herself where she could not be easily seen from outside. The riders dismounted and approached the front door. Their leader, a thin man with cold eyes, knocked with unnecessary force. Grizzly opened the door but did not invite them inside. The conversation was brief and pointed. They had heard about the girl who survived yesterday's lesson in frontier justice. They wanted to confirm she had moved on as expected. Grizzly's responses were non-committal, but satisfied their immediate curiosity. After they left, Miriam emerged from hiding with fire in her eyes. The casual nature of their inquiry told her everything she needed to know. These men viewed her as a minor inconvenience to be managed, not a legitimate threat to be feared. That was their first mistake. "They don't know about the documents," she said. "Not yet, but they will soon enough." Miriam stood and walked to the window, watching the riders disappear into the distance. Her father had prepared her for this moment her entire life. Every lesson in surveying and law had been building toward this confrontation. "I need to get to Cheyenne. The territorial offices will have copies of my father's original filings, proof that can't be destroyed or questioned." Grizzly studied her carefully. The frightened girl from last night had been replaced by someone harder and more focused, someone who understood exactly what she was up against. "That's a dangerous trip, especially for someone carrying what you're carrying." "More dangerous than staying here while Caldwell figures out who I really am?" She had a point. Once Caldwell learned about Marcus Carter's daughter and her legal inheritance, subtle intimidation would give way to direct action. Men who built fortunes on stolen land did not surrender them peacefully. "I'll come with you," Grizzly said simply. Miriam turned to face him, surprise evident in her expression. She had not expected such loyalty from a stranger who owed her nothing. "You don't understand what you're offering. This isn't just about land. It's about power, money, the kind of wealth that makes men do terrible things." Grizzly's response came without hesitation. "Then you'll need help." Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The morning's calm was giving way to something darker and more turbulent. Change was coming to Cedar Falls territory, whether its current masters wanted it or not. Miriam looked at her father's maps one final time before securing them safely away. She was no longer running from her inheritance. She was ready to claim it. The orange glow against the night sky told them everything they needed to know. Grizzly's cabin was burning, flames licking hungrily at the roof as sparks danced in the darkness. They watched from the ridge above, their horses breathing hard from the desperate ride back from town. Miriam felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This destruction was her fault. Her presence had brought Caldwell's wrath down on the one man who had shown her kindness. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Grizzly's face remained impassive as he watched 2 years of solitary life disappear into smoke and ash. "Property can be rebuilt. We can't." They turned their horses toward the territorial road that would take them to Cheyenne. Behind them, the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks that illuminated the valley like a funeral pyre. The first day of travel passed in tense silence. They followed cattle trails and creek beds, avoiding the main roads where Caldwell's men might be watching. Grizzly proved to be an expert at reading the landscape, finding paths that existed only in his memory. As they made camp that evening beside a hidden spring, Miriam finally asked the question that had been troubling her all day. "You know this country too well for a simple cowboy." Grizzly fed dry branches to their small fire, his movements economical and practiced. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories he rarely shared. "Army Intelligence, Territorial Mapping Division, spent 3 years surveying this region during the war." The revelation explained much about his careful movements and alert awareness. It also explained why he had recognized the professional quality of her father's survey work. "You knew my father's documents were legitimate the moment I saw them. Your father used standard military surveying techniques, government stamps and measurements, the kind of work I supervised for years." Miriam stared into the fire, processing this new information. Her rescue had not been random kindness from a stranger. It had been recognition from someone who understood exactly what those papers represented. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to reach the same conclusion yourself. Trust comes from understanding, not from being told what to believe." They reached the first settlement the next afternoon. Willow Creek consisted of a dozen buildings clustered around a crossroads trading post. The owner, a weathered woman named Beth Morrison, eyed them suspiciously until Grizzly mentioned his military service. Her attitude changed immediately. Her husband had served in the same territorial division. She offered them food and information in exchange for news from the outside world. The information proved valuable. Beth had heard stories about families losing land to powerful cattlemen who used legal tricks and intimidation. The pattern was spreading across multiple territories, always following the same methods. "It's not just happening here," Beth explained as she served them fresh bread. "My sister lives near Laramie, says the same thing is going on there. Big ranchers buying up land cheap from folks who suddenly can't prove their claims." More disturbing was her news about official corruption. Territorial offices had been losing records with suspicious frequency. Documents that proved inconvenient ownership claims seemed particularly prone to disappearing. "You folks be careful in Cheyenne. Word is, some of those clerks have been bought and paid for." They left Willow Creek with heavier hearts but clearer understanding. Caldwell was not acting alone. This was part of a larger conspiracy to concentrate land ownership in the hands of wealthy interests. The second settlement brought them face to face with the human cost of these schemes. Pine Ridge had once been a thriving community of small ranchers and farmers. Now it looked like a ghost town, with empty houses and abandoned businesses. They found the former residents camped beside the creek south of town. 12 families living in makeshift shelters, their possessions reduced to what could fit in wagons. Their leader, an elderly man named Jim Whitfield, welcomed the newcomers with desperate hope. "You folks looking for land? Because there's plenty available now. Course, you'll have to deal with Caldwell's people to get it." His story matched what Miriam had suspected. Caldwell's men had arrived with lawyers and documents proving the family's claims were invalid. When some residents protested, their houses had burned under mysterious circumstances. The local sheriff had suggested they move on for their own safety. "The strangest part was the lawyer," Jim continued. "He knew details about our land that weren't in any public records, boundary markers we'd never told anyone about, water rights we'd established through use but never formally filed." Sarah Whitfield, Jim's wife, had been listening from beside their wagon. She approached as her husband finished his story, her face grave with memory. "I knew your father, child. Marcus Carter was trying to organize us before he passed. Said we needed to document everything properly, or we'd lose it all." The confirmation hit Miriam like a physical blow. Her father had not simply been protecting his own claim. He had been working to help others protect theirs as well. His death had ended their only chance at organized resistance. "He was right," Sarah continued. "Marcus saw what was coming before any of us understood the danger." That evening, as the displaced families shared their meager dinner around a communal fire, Miriam began to understand the true scope of her inheritance. She was not just fighting for land. She was fighting for the principle that legal ownership meant something more than the ability to enforce it through violence and corruption. Grizzly watched her interact with the families, noting how naturally she assumed a leadership role. Her education and legal knowledge made her invaluable to people who had been defeated by their own ignorance of complex property law. "We'll find proof in Cheyenne," she promised them, "proof that can't be destroyed or ignored." Jim Whitfield looked at her with the first hope he had felt in months. "And then what?" Miriam's answer carried the determination her father had instilled in her through years of preparation. Then we take back what belongs to us. Cheyenne's territorial offices occupied a limestone building that projected governmental authority through its solid construction and imposing columns. Miriam and Grizzly approached the entrance with careful optimism, her father's satchel tucked securely beneath her arm. The clerk at the front desk, a thin man with nervous eyes, barely looked up from his ledger when they requested access to land records. His dismissive wave toward a back room suggested this was routine business, requiring minimal attention. The record room contained rows of wooden filing cabinets and dusty ledgers dating back to the territory's establishment. Miriam began her search methodically, using the filing system her father had taught her to navigate government bureaucracy. After 2 hours of searching, she found the first disturbing evidence. The drawer that should have contained surveys from her father's active period was nearly empty. Dozens of documents were simply missing, leaving gaps in the chronological sequence that suggested systematic removal rather than random loss. "Someone's been here before us," she whispered to Grizzly. A soft cough behind them announced the presence of another person in the room. They turned to find a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, her arms full of additional ledgers. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you looking for specific land records?" The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, a senior clerk who had worked in the territorial offices for 15 years. Her offer to help seemed genuine, and her knowledge of the filing system proved invaluable. "We've had some problems with missing documents lately," Mrs. Hayes explained as she guided them to a different section of files. "But we keep duplicate records in a separate archive. What name are you researching?" When Miriam mentioned Marcus Carter, Mrs. Hayes's expression brightened with recognition. "I remember your father's work. Very thorough surveyor, professional quality documentation." She led them to a locked cabinet and retrieved a key from her desk drawer. Inside were the archived copies of Marcus Carter's original surveys, complete with government seals and official signatures. Miriam spread the documents on a nearby table, her hands trembling slightly as she verified every detail. The surveys were perfect, professional, indisputable. They proved beyond question that her father had legally claimed and registered nearly 10,000 acres of prime territorial land. "These are exactly what we needed," she said quietly. Mrs. Hayes examined the documents with obvious expertise, nodding approvingly at the technical precision of the survey work. "Your father followed proper procedures perfectly. These claims are absolutely legitimate under territorial law." But as they prepared to make copies of the crucial documents, Mrs. Hayes's expression grew troubled. "I should warn you about something. There have been inquiries about the Carter land records, important people asking specific questions about your family's holdings." The warning sent ice through Miriam's veins. If Caldwell's influence reached into the territorial offices, their legal victory might be meaningless. "What kind of inquiries?" "Political connections. People with enough influence to make documents disappear permanently. I've been instructed to report any interest in certain land records." Mrs. Hayes glanced around the empty record room and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "There's something else you should know. We've been hearing rumors about federal investigations into territorial land fraud. Someone in Washington is asking uncomfortable questions about how certain properties changed hands." This news offered hope, tinged with uncertainty. Federal intervention could protect them from local corruption, but it might also slow the process of reclaiming their land. "Do you know when this investigation might reach our area?" "Soon, I think. We've had visits from people asking questions about missing records and suspicious property transfers. They seemed particularly interested in large land acquisitions made through questionable legal methods." Miriam carefully stored the copied documents in her father's satchel alongside the originals. She now possessed unshakable proof of her legal claim, but she also understood the dangerous territory they were entering. As they prepared to leave Cheyenne, Mrs. Hayes pulled Miriam aside with additional advice. "Be very careful who you trust with this information, and keep those documents safe. They're worth more than you know." The return journey to Cedar Falls took on new urgency. Miriam and Grizzly pushed their horses hard, following back trails and avoiding settlements where Caldwell's influence might reach them. During their second night on the road, they encountered another group of displaced families heading east. These refugees carried stories of escalating intimidation and violence directed at anyone who questioned Caldwell's expanding empire. "He's getting desperate," the group's leader explained around their campfire. "Started making bigger moves, more aggressive tactics. Like he's racing against some kind of deadline." The observation troubled Miriam deeply. Desperate men made dangerous choices, especially when their fortunes depended on maintaining control through illegal means. Grizzly shared her concerns. His military experience had taught him to recognize the signs of an enemy preparing for decisive action. "We need to move fast once we get back, present our evidence publicly before Caldwell realizes what we have." They reached the outskirts of Cedar Falls territory as the sun set on their third day of travel. In the distance, smoke rose from several locations that suggested more buildings had burned in their absence. Miriam studied the landscape that legally belonged to her, calculating the challenges ahead. She possessed the documents needed to prove her claim. She had allies willing to support her cause, but she also faced an enemy with political connections, financial resources, and a willingness to use violence when legal methods failed. The monthly territorial meeting was scheduled for the following week. Representatives from the federal government would be present to hear petitions and address disputes. It would be her best opportunity to present evidence in a forum that Caldwell could not completely control. As they rode toward the settlement where their allies waited, Miriam felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer fighting just for her own inheritance. She had become the leader of everyone who had suffered under Caldwell's corrupt system. The final confrontation was approaching, and everything would depend on her ability to prove that justice could triumph over power when supported by truth and courage. The night before the territorial meeting, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes arrived at their camp under cover of darkness. Her unexpected appearance sent murmurs of concern through the gathered families who had been preparing for tomorrow's confrontation. Miriam met her at the edge of their makeshift settlement, noting the woman's nervous energy and frequent glances over her shoulder. Something had changed since their encounter in Cheyenne. "I needed to speak with you before tomorrow," Mrs. Hayes said quietly. "There are things you don't understand about what's really happening here." She led Miriam and Grizzly away from the others, choosing a spot where their conversation could not be overheard. In the moonlight, her familiar face took on an entirely different character. "My name is Eleanor Hayes, but I'm not just a territorial clerk." Her voice carried new authority as she continued. "I'm a United States Marshal, working undercover to investigate land fraud across multiple territories." The revelation hit Miriam like a physical blow. The helpful woman who had guided them through government archives was actually a federal law enforcement officer conducting her own investigation. "Everything I've told you about your father's documents is true, but I've been building a much larger case against Caldwell and his associates. A case that reaches all the way to Washington." Marshal Hayes explained that she had been working undercover for 8 months, documenting systematic land fraud across the Western territories. Caldwell was not operating alone. He was part of a network of wealthy investors using corrupt local officials to steal property from legitimate owners. "Your father's case became crucial to our investigation when we realized the scope of Caldwell's operations. The land he stole from your family represents the center of his entire empire." Grizzly listened with the focused attention of his military training. "How long have you known about Miriam's claim?" "Since the first day you walked into my office. Your father's surveys were some of the most professional work I'd seen. When his daughter appeared with the original documents, I knew we had the evidence needed to bring down Caldwell's entire operation." Marshal Hayes pulled a leather portfolio from beneath her coat. Inside were dozens of documents, photographs, and witness statements that painted a comprehensive picture of territorial corruption. "Caldwell has been forging property transfers, bribing local officials, and intimidating legitimate landowners across 3 territories. Your case gives us the legal foundation to prosecute everyone involved." The marshal's presence transformed tomorrow's territorial meeting from a local dispute into a federal investigation. Caldwell would not be facing accusations from displaced families. He would be confronting criminal charges from the United States government. "What do you need from us?" Miriam asked. "Present your evidence exactly as we planned. But be prepared for Caldwell to react violently when he realizes the scope of what he's facing." Marshal Hayes provided them with additional documentation that would support Miriam's testimony. Federal arrest warrants were already prepared, waiting only for the public presentation of evidence to justify their execution. As dawn approached, the displaced families began gathering at the settlement center. Word had spread through the refugee camps that today would determine their collective future. Men, women, and children who had lost everything to Caldwell's greed looked to Miriam with desperate hope. The territorial meeting convened in Cedar Falls' largest building, a wooden structure that normally served as a community hall. Federal representatives sat at a long table facing rows of chairs filled with settlers, ranchers, and townspeople. Caldwell arrived with an entourage of lawyers and armed men, his confidence evident in every gesture. He clearly expected to handle this challenge the same way he had dealt with previous legal obstacles. When Miriam's name was called, she walked to the front of the room with steady composure. Her father's satchel contained not only the original surveys, but also the additional evidence Marshal Hayes had provided. She began her presentation by establishing her father's credentials as a territorial surveyor. The federal representatives examined Marcus Carter's original documentation with obvious expertise, noting the professional quality of his work. As Miriam detailed the scope of her legal claim, murmurs of surprise rippled through the assembled crowd. Few had understood that the quiet young woman was claiming ownership of nearly 10,000 acres of prime territory. Caldwell's lawyers immediately challenged the authenticity of the documents, but their objections crumbled under federal scrutiny. The surveys bore official government seals that could not be forged or questioned. The moment of truth arrived when Marshal Hayes stood and revealed her true identity. The shocked silence that followed her announcement gave way to chaos as the implications became clear. "Ethan Caldwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal land ownership laws." Federal deputies who had been positioned throughout the room moved swiftly to prevent any attempt at escape. Caldwell's armed men found themselves facing superior numbers and federal authority that rendered their intimidation tactics useless. The arrest warrants extended beyond Caldwell to include corrupt local officials who had facilitated his illegal activities. The sheriff who had allowed Miriam's beating was among those taken into federal custody. As the dust settled, Marshal Hayes addressed the assembled crowd with the authority of federal law behind her words. "All property transfers executed through fraudulent means will be reversed. Legitimate landowners will have their claims restored through proper legal channels." Miriam stood at the center of the transformed room, holding the documents that had triggered this cascade of justice. The frightened girl who had stolen bread to survive had become the catalyst for exposing territorial corruption on a massive scale. The cheers from displaced families echoed through the building as they realized their long nightmare was finally ending. Justice had prevailed not through violence, but through courage, evidence, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. Caldwell's empire had crumbled in a single morning, brought down by a young woman who refused to surrender her father's legacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Miriam stood on the ridge where her father's original cabin had once overlooked the land. 6 months had passed since Caldwell's arrest, and the transformation below exceeded even her most optimistic dreams. Where abandoned homesteads had once dotted the landscape, thriving farms now stretched toward the horizon. The Whitfield family had rebuilt their house near the eastern creek, their cattle grazing peacefully in pastures they legally owned once again. Sarah Whitfield waved from her garden as she spotted Miriam on the hilltop. The federal investigation had moved with remarkable efficiency once Marshal Hayes revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Property deeds forged in Caldwell's network were systematically overturned, returning thousands of acres to their rightful owners across 3 territories. The ripple effects had reached all the way to Washington, where several politicians faced corruption charges. Grizzly approached from behind, his footsteps quiet on the rocky ground. In his hands were the architectural plans they had been discussing for weeks. Their new home would sit exactly where her father's cabin had stood, honoring his memory while looking toward their shared future. "The foundation work starts next week," he said, spreading the drawings on a flat boulder. "Jim Whitfield says he can spare 3 men from his crew to help with the construction." The cooperative system Miriam had established was working better than anyone had expected. Instead of claiming the entire 10,000 acres for herself, she had divided the land among families who had lost their homes to Caldwell's schemes. Each family received enough acreage to support themselves while contributing to the larger community's success. The water rights that had made the land so valuable were managed collectively, ensuring fair distribution among all the settlements. Former enemies had become neighbors, working together to build something stronger than any individual ranch could achieve alone. Miriam examined the house plans with growing excitement. The design incorporated elements from her father's original cabin while adding modern conveniences that would make their life more comfortable. Large windows would frame views of the valley where their community flourished. "There's something else we need to discuss," Grizzly said, his voice carrying a nervous undertone she had rarely heard before. He knelt on one knee beside the boulder, pulling a simple gold band from his vest pocket. The ring had belonged to his grandmother, carried across the frontier in hopes of finding someone worthy of its promise. "Miriam Carter, you fought for this land with more courage than any soldier I've ever known. Will you help me build something permanent here? Will you marry me?" Her answer came without hesitation, accompanied by tears of joy that reflected the morning sunlight. They had survived beatings, fire, legal battles, and political corruption together. Marriage felt like the natural next step in a partnership that had already weathered every possible test. The wedding took place 2 months later in the valley's center, surrounded by the families who had become their extended community. Marshal Hayes attended, having taken leave from her federal duties to witness the ceremony that had grown from her investigation. Beth Morrison from Willow Creek provided the wedding cake, refusing payment for what she called a celebration of justice triumphing over greed. The displaced families who had once lived in wagons beside Pine Ridge now arrived in their own carriages, dressed in their finest clothes for the occasion. Pastor Williams, who had traveled from Cheyenne specifically for the ceremony, spoke about love growing from shared struggle and communities built on mutual respect rather than fear. His words carried special meaning for people who had experienced both systems firsthand. As autumn arrived, Miriam and Grizzly moved into their completed home. The house commanded a perfect view of the cooperative settlements while providing the privacy they needed as newlyweds. Every window framed a different aspect of the land they had fought to reclaim. The success of their agricultural cooperative had attracted attention from territorial officials who visited regularly to study their methods. Other regions were beginning to implement similar systems, proving that cooperation could be more profitable than the exploitation they had replaced. Miriam found herself serving as an unofficial advisor to families facing land disputes across the Western Territories. Her combination of legal knowledge and practical experience made her invaluable to people navigating complex property laws. Letters arrived weekly requesting her assistance with documentation and territorial procedures. The first snow of winter was falling when Miriam discovered she was carrying their first child. The news filled both of them with joy, tinged by the weight of responsibility. They would be raising their family in the community they had helped create. Grizzly proved to be an attentive, expectant father, ensuring Miriam received proper rest while managing the cooperative's daily operations. His military organizational skills translated perfectly to coordinating multiple farming families and their seasonal schedules. Spring brought the birth of their daughter, whom they named Hope after the quality that had sustained them through their darkest moments. The entire community celebrated her arrival, understanding that she represented the future they had all worked to secure. As Miriam nursed her baby on the front porch of their home, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened girl who had stolen bread to survive had become a landowner, community leader, wife, and mother. Below them, the valley bustled with the activity of families who owned their land legally and worked it cooperatively. Children played in gardens their parents had planted on property that could never again be stolen through corruption or intimidation. The sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that seemed to bless the peaceful scene below. Hope slept contentedly in her mother's arms while Grizzly sat beside them, his weathered hand gentle on his daughter's tiny fingers. Their story had begun with violence and desperation, but had transformed into something beautiful through courage, justice, and love that had endured against every challenge the frontier could present.